Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Glad you could make it for the CPS web tips. We're probably going to wait a couple more minutes here to see if get some late time attendees to show up. So we'll have to start here in about, I don't know, just a couple minutes. Okay, I think we've waited long enough. So what we'll do is get started. Today we're going to talk about some dates and numbers in Composer. And to start with, we'll just get some logistics working. Let's see if we can get my next slide going. So just to begin with, we put everybody on mute for the time being. If we need to, we can change people to ask some questions. Otherwise, we'll just have the questions be added to the chat box, and we'll address them afterwards. We're not going to do any kind of polling today, so maybe in future web tips and webinars we'll do that. So let's get started. A little bit about myself. My name is Gary Clough, and software engineer by trade. I've been working with forms and workflow for over 15 years now with several different companies. I was actually employed by WINSHUTTLE for about 4 years and was hired to actually develop the Composer product. And in January of last year, 2017, I started with CPS, actually using the product to implement solutions as a solution architect. So enough about me. Kind of get into what we're going to talk about today. Dates and numbers kind of have their own life in Composer, and when you're working with forms, depending on your locale and your language settings. So kind of the theme here is what you see is not necessarily what you get, and I'll get into a little bit more detail of what that means as we get through the presentation. But some of the topics we're going to look at is localization and what locales are and how they affect what your form looks like and what gets displayed on your form. The different formats for dates and numbers and why they're represented the way they are. And then just Composer, using dates and numbers in Composer, and how it stores that information, and then we'll actually look at a little demo of how they actually work within Composer, both dates and numbers. So we'll start off with what localization is and what a locale is. So obviously there's a bunch of different languages in the world today, and so when you build your form, you want to be able to support all these different languages, and that in itself is considered localization. So localization a lot of times is thought of as just translating all the labels. Well, there's a little bit more to that because you want your form to kind of adapt to the different languages and the regions within the different languages so that it's more user-friendly and you see the data in their own specific formats. And that's where the word locale comes in. Locale is used to not only define the language, but actually the location or geographical region that a user is in, because you could have the same language but in different locations or different geographical regions, you could have different representations of the data. So it's just a different setting that that gets looked at to determine what the format should be for these dates and numbers. As an example, there are actually two components to a locale. So there's a language code, and then there's the optional country code or region code. And based on those two settings, you get different formats that you want represented on your form. So a couple of examples here in the image. If you're in English, English uses a comma as a thousand separator and a period as a decimal separator, and the default date format is month, day, year. Now, if you go to Great Britain, also speaks English, but and they also use a comma separator and a dot for decimals, but they like to have their dates in date, month, year instead of month, day, year. Another example is French. They don't use a comma separator; it's a space. I mean, a thousand separator; it's a space, and their decimal separator is actually common. They too have date, month, year, date format, and then on down the line. You'll notice that, like if you're in Switzerland and you speak French, they use dot as a delimiter for the date. And then in German, they use a dot as a thousand separator and a comma as the decimal place. So again, these are just several examples of the different types of formats that need to be displayed on the form when a user comes in and looks at the form based on these languages in this locale. The good news about all of this is the date and number formats are automatically handled for you within Composer based on the browser language settings. So depending on what language you have set in your browser, the dates and numbers are automatically going to be reformatted in the correct format based on the locale. And you can also have multiple number and date formats within the same locale. So for example, on a number, you may want to show the thousand separator, or you might not, or you may want to show the precision of 5 or precision of 3. So you can do that. You can set those you can set those formats, and it will be updated in no matter what locale you have configured or set. The bad news here, which isn't really bad news, but is that what you see on the form is not necessarily what is stored behind the scenes. And the reason that is the case is because what's on the form is just for display purposes, and the actual date and numbers have to be stored in some neutral format for it to be able to get converted depending on the locale. So that can be confusing sometimes when you see a date or a number in a specific format, and then you try to set another field or use it in a web service or something like that, and it's completely different. And that's because the internal representation is this neutral format. And so that's kind of what we need to understand, and through all of this is that what you see is not necessarily what you get. So working with dates in Composer, we talked a little bit about that neutral format, and that in this case, it's the year, the month, and the day with dashes and a four-digit year. So this is what every date picker that's on a Composer form is, the internal representation is in this format. So independent of what locale you have, what formatting you have, this is the format that's going to be stored and used behind the scenes. So if you do need to use the date value in a rule, or when you maybe map it to a web service for SAP, this is the value that's going to be sent and used in those rules or those web services. If, for example, you need to use a different format, we can set up what's called a helper field, and I'll show you a little bit how to do that within this presentation here. And what that does is allows you to reformat this format into the format that you need, and then use that as your arguments to your web service or in your rules, etc. So dates, you can also set hard code some different date formats. You'll see a date format property when you look at any date element in Composer. And the first one is default locale. And so if it's set to that, then by default, it's going to automatically convert your date representation to whatever locale is defined within your browser. And this is where all this happens automatically for you. One of the kind of confusing parts about this date format property is if you do set it to, month, day, year, or month dash day dash year, it's going to always show that on your form. Independent of whatever language you have selected or configured, it's always going to show it in that representation. The internal representation does not change anything, but it's not going to automatically change based on your locale if you set it to a specific date format. If you do set it to like January 01, 2000, it will actually it'll actually translate the month. But again, it's going to hard code it, so it's not going to change based to the default locale representation. So a little bit about this helper field. Again, typically if a web service requires a different format than the YYY-MM-DD format, you have to implement this helper field. And the idea behind this is that you would create a separate text field, and it's important that it's a text field that you add to your form that's going to contain this newly formatted representation of your date. And what you do is you put a rule on the date picker element that formats that date value and saves it into this helper field. And then you can use that helper field as part of your mapping or your inputs to your web services. To give you a little bit more detailed example, this is what you would end up doing. So if your required date format is like month, day, year with dashes, and you have your date picker, your date picker field is DP underscore field, that's the field name of your date picker. You would create a helper field, a text field, maybe called DP field underscore helper, whatever you want to name it. And then you would put a rule on the date picker field. And as you look down at the bottom there, what it's doing is it's setting the helper field and you're reformatting the date of your date picker field to this month, day, year. And so now this DP field helper contains this same date, but now it's in a different format, and you can now use that helper field for any kind of calculations or if you want to map it to a web service, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully that'll make sense. And there is, I think, a nice knowledge base article on the WINSHUTTLE support or help pages that outlines this, and I think it might even have a sample solution that you can download. So that kind of goes over how you handle dates. Numbers are very similar. They also have like a neutral format, an internal representation. And it's just the number with a period as a decimal separator. The key thing to remember here is internally, numbers are just numbers, and what it's going to do is store that number in its highest precision. So if you do any calculations or you type in up to 8 decimal points, it's going to save it internally as 8 decimal points, independent of what the format is on your form. So you may have a format on your form that says I only want to show 2 decimal places and I want to show 1,000 separator. Well, you'll see that, but internally you're going to see the number in this format up here, and it's going to store it in the most precise value as possible. So if you do need to have a specific precision, and I believe SAP sometimes requires that you can't have more than 2 decimal places in some of their input fields, you can actually create a custom rule that sets the fixed value of these numbers to however many decimal places that you would like. So for example, at the bottom there, it's just a set value call that's fixing it to 2 decimal places. And in this case, if you set the actual number element, it's going to change the internal representation as well. So you really don't need a helper element to reformat your date into a specific format. In this case, the number of decimal points. Again, the number element has a number format property, and these are all of the different formats that you can specify. This is also what's called a combo box, so you could actually type in your own patterns into this box if these number patterns here aren't enough, or you don't see something in there that you actually want to set. You can type in your own format. And the link here shows you where to go to kind of figure out what that pattern should look like and what symbols represent numbers and decimal points and that type of stuff. But with the number format, again, this is really just telling the system not exactly what you want it to look like, but what you want it to represent. So like the first one, the 1,234.56, that's saying that I want to show a 1,000 separator, and I only want it to be 2 decimal places. So even if you went in as German or French, it's going to show the 1,000 separator. It's not going to be a comma though, it's going to be a dot, because that's the locale in which it defines that. So this just showed these number formats just represent, you know, the idea of what it should look like, and then it's going to obviously change based on the locale that's configured in your browser. And I'll show you what that looks like too in the demo we do. Well, there we go. We're at the demo. So let's stop this and move on to the demo. And if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and just type them into the question section of the webinar, and I'll get to them once we complete the demo here. So the first thing we're going to do here, my browser is set to English, and we have a standard date picker here. So, and actually, let me do this first. Let's go to the solution first. And so what I did is I created a solution here. I have 3 date pickers on the left. And then what I did is I created a rule on each one of these date pickers that just goes and sets this value here to show you what the internal representation is. So it's just a simple rule that takes the value of the date picker and puts it into this text field that I've added to the form, and that should show you what the internal representation is. The first one is just a standard default locale date format. The second one, I changed the date format to use the full month name. And then the third one is this helper rule that I kind of discussed. And the default value, or the format, is default locale. And then in this one, I have a different rule, and we're going to look at this rule. And so what this one does is actually calls format date. So it's going to take the value of the date picker and format it into the mm-dd-yy format and set it into this helper field. And this is my helper field here. So when we change this, it's going to execute the rule. It's going to take the value of this, which is in the YYY-mm-dd format, and it's going to reformat it to the format needed for whatever purpose. And it'll display it here to show you kind of how that formatting rule works. So first we'll kind of go over here and do this real time. So again, this is the default locale. I'm currently set at English, so it's going to give me the default month, day, year. But you'll notice the internal representation is that YYY-mm-dd. So this is what is always stored within Composer for these date picker fields. This one, we had a specific format on it, so now we have the January 31, 2018, and again, what you see is not what you get. The internal representation is this. So if we did use this date picker field for a web service or rule, whatever, this is the value that's going to be used. Now the last one is again just a standard default locale, but this one ran through the formatting rule to change the format and apply it to this helper field. So now you'll see that the actual helper field here is now 1/31/2018 in the format that I want, and I could use that field now in any kind of SAP or any kind of web service or rule or whatever, knowing that it's in this specific format. When it comes to locales, I'm doing this in Chrome right now, but if you go to settings, and every browser has a different way of changing their language settings, but if you go to advanced and you hit the language, I have a bunch of different languages added. I'm going to just move French to the top, and we'll come over here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to save this guy, and so that the next time it comes in, maybe it gets routed to somebody in a different country, Now when I open this, you'll see it's now changed to month, day, year, which is the French way of looking at things. Internal representation is still exactly the same. It's in the neutral format. You'll see it translated January, but kept that same format. And then also this one here, exactly the same. It changed the default representation, but it still kept the helper field date representation. So I hope that all makes sense there. That also works for inputs too. I mean, if I change this, it's going to keep that same representation based on the user's locale. Let's move this back to English. Refresh. And let's go back to the composer solution. So that was kind of the dates and how they're handled. Numbers are, again, pretty much the same. They have a neutral representation. And what I did here is this is just a standard number. I have it set to the default format that Composer uses, which is no 1000 separator and 3 decimal places. So this will show you what the internal representation is, because I have another rule on here that does the exact same thing. It just sets this text field to the representation of what this number element has. And I did that for this one. This one actually has a different format where we're going to show the 1000 separator, and we're going to restrict it to 2 decimal places, but we also want to pad it to 0. So this would be good for currency, for example. And then we're going to show the internal format here again with that rule. Now this last one is where we may want to set the fixed value to, say, 2 decimal places, but internally we want to do that. So in this case, this has 2 rules on it. So the first rule is I'm going to take this standard number field, which is the one on the left here, and I'm going to apply this toFixed rule to it. And what that's doing, that's actually changing it on this field, which will actually also change the internal representation. And to show that, after I change it here on the number element, I'm going to actually copy that value to the internal representation text field here, and you'll see that they're both the same. So hopefully showing you this will better explain it. So this is just a standard number here. If I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you'll see that it truncated this to 3 decimal places because that's the number format that I had displayed or configured. Yet the internal representation still has the full number, and it doesn't have a 1000 separator because I didn't have that in my format. This one, however, we wanted to show the 1000 separator, and we wanted to change it to 2 decimal places, but you'll see that, again, the internal representation has the entire value. This one did have a other format on it where it would 0 pad, so you'll see that it actually put the 0 in here, and you'll see this is the new internal representation. Does not have the 0 because it doesn't need it. That's in terms of the neutral format. And then the last one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one had that rule that will automatically change and fix this value to 2 decimal places, and you'll see that the internal representation also is set at 2 decimal places. So this is one way you can change the internal representation so that you don't have to use a helper field. You could actually use this field right here as part of your web service or any rules or calculations or whatever that you might want to do. And I guess we'll do one last thing. We'll change this. Actually, I already have settings here. We'll change this back to French. Move to top. And see how this changes things. So you'll see in French, the comma separator or the 1000 separator is a space. The decimal separator is a comma, etc. So you'll see how it's formatted, but yet the internal representations are exactly the same. Okay, so that kind of does it for the demonstration and the presentation. Let's get back to this guy. Oops, I don't want to start from the beginning. Let's go back here and we're open for any questions, and let me check and see if we have any. Doesn't look like we do at this point. If you do have any questions, obviously feel free to put them in there. I'll wait a few minutes, and hopefully some will come through. And this presentation will be posted up on YouTube with all of our other web tips. Okay, well, it doesn't look like there's any questions. If something comes through a little later, we can talk about that, or we can answer it. Just another couple of things is we do have these web tips every once a month, every Thursday. I think it's the second Thursday of every month. Next month in February, it's going to be more revolving around Studio and chaining web services, and then the following month we're going to do talk about naming conventions for foundation solutions. And typically what we like to do is every month we'll alternate between Studio topics and foundation topics. And if you want to register for any of these, you can go to Clear Process Solutions, and you can do that there. Oh, looks like I might have a question. If I can figure out how to read it. Is there a way to truncate the integer part of a number similar to the decimal place? Well, so you want to just, there's not really, because what you type in is what you're going to get. I mean, you could apply some JavaScript. There's a couple of JavaScript functions that you could use to round or floor, but the decimal portion is pretty much what you type in is what you're going to get. So your web service field only accepts 1,000, but user in 10,000. Oh yeah. You can do that. Matter of fact, there's a minimum and a maximum value that you can apply to as properties. Doesn't look like that's the only question.
Gary, I don't know if you see, looks like there's two other questions.
Oh, are there?
Were you only seeing the one there?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Another question was, how about using the Excel upload into a form with a number or date format fields? Is there anything specific to do?
It's in terms of dates, yes. The date will have to be in the YYY-MM-DD format if you're going to populate a date picker element. So the field in Excel has to be in that format because that's the format that is required to set those date picker elements. As far as numbers, they would have to be, again, in the neutral format, which would just be the decimal point. The period is the decimal separator. It wouldn't know how to interpret the different thousand separators. And was there another one?
Okay, yeah,
Ken?
another question. Say your web service field only accepts 1,000, but users enter 10,000.
Yeah, I tried to answer that. Was that within Composer, there should be a min value and a max value that you can specify. either through a rule, or I thought there might even be a property that specifies min and max values. If not, you could just apply a rule that that checks for it and doesn't allow it to be entered. And if you have any questions like on how to do some of this stuff, feel free to give us a call, and we'd be more than happy to help you out do that and show you how to do some of this stuff. Let's see if I can see the rest of these. I'm not sure why it's only showing one.
That looks to be the questions that I see, unless anybody has any last-minute questions they want to submit.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you for attending. And a couple other things that we want to note is we do have a program called Solution Care that supplements the WINSHUTTLE maintenance that you probably have. And there's quite a few benefits of using this. And this is a kind of a little breakdown matrix of some of the services that we provide as part of this Solution Care. It's something that you can read more about on our Clear Process Solutions website, but we have a lot of customers using it. They seem to be pretty happy with it. And if you have any more questions about it, feel free to give us a call or take a look at the website. And I think that's about it. If you have, like I said, questions, feel free to call us or contact us via the website or the email at info@clearprocess.solutions.com. Thank you again for attending, and hopefully you guys can all join some of the future webinars.